When I found the $15,000 Cartier receipt in Brandon's blazer pocket, I knew my marriage was a performance where I'd been playing the fool. 3 days earlier, he'd looked me straight in the eye and said we couldn't afford Sophie's music school tuition because money was tight. And now I stood in our laundry room holding glossy proof that tight meant different things for different people in his world. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, stay with me, because this is the story of how I became impossible to ignore. The paper felt expensive between my fingers. That heavy cream cardstock luxury stores use. March 19th. Diamond necklace. Paid in full. I could smell his cologne still clinging to the fabric. That woody, expensive scent mixed now with something floral, and decidedly not mine. My hands weren't shaking yet. That would come later. Right now I just felt cold, like someone had opened a window directly into my chest. Sophie was at school. Brandon was at work, or wherever he actually went during those long evenings when he said inventory needed counting. The house was silent except for the washer's gentle hum, that domestic soundtrack that had become the background noise of my entire existence for 8 years. I'd been doing his laundry, separating darks from lights like a good wife, when my fingers found the folded rectangle. I sat down right there on the laundry room floor and let myself actually think about the last 8 years for maybe the first time since our wedding. Brandon Ashford had walked into my classroom 9 years ago during career day, all confident smiles and expensive suit. After his presentation, he'd asked me to coffee. I'd been 27, idealistic, convinced that love conquered everything, including the small voice in my head that whispered he interrupted me constantly and never asked questions about my life. That voice got quieter over the years. Brandon made sure of it. 3 months after Sophie was born, he'd pinched the soft flesh at my waist like he was inspecting damaged merchandise and told me no man wanted a sloppy wife. I remember the fluorescent bathroom light flickering. I remember Sophie crying in the nursery. I remember feeling nothing but shame because Brandon's disgust was so palpable I could taste it metallic in my mouth. I'd started skipping meals after that. The weight came off, 43 pounds over 7 months. And when I finally fit back into my pre-pregnancy jeans, he just shrugged and said at least, now I didn't embarrass him as much in public. That should have been my first clue that nothing I did would ever be enough. I quit teaching when Sophie was born, but quit isn't the right word. Brandon eroded my confidence until leaving felt like the only logical choice. He'd asked if I really thought I could handle 30 rebellious teenagers when I could barely control our own daughter. He'd listed my failures like evidence. The burned chicken, the forgotten electric bill, my unreliability that everyone noticed. So I'd stayed home and accepted the monthly allowance of $800 like it was generous instead of controlling. The receipt crinkled in my grip. $15,000. Sophie's entire year of music school cost $3,000. Brandon had called that irresponsible spending. Meanwhile, he was buying diamond necklaces for women who weren't his wife. Soon, Sophie would be home from school. Soon I'd need to start dinner. Something Brandon wouldn't criticize. Soon he'd walk through that door, expecting his perfectly maintained home and his perfectly diminished wife. But something was different now. I had proof. Not just suspicion he'd gaslight away, but actual tangible evidence that the man who controlled every dollar I spent had $15,000 for another woman's neck. I stood up slowly and caught my reflection in the small mirror by the laundry room door. The woman looking back was 36, but could pass for 45. Hair, in the same messy bun I'd worn for years because Brandon said my styling attempts looked desperate. Face bare because he'd criticized every shade until I stopped trying. Clothes shapeless and gray because anything fitted was inappropriate, and anything colorful was attention-seeking. This woman was a stranger, but underneath the exhaustion and defeat, I could see shadows of who I used to be. Rachel Summers, the teacher whose students wrote thank you notes, the woman who read 3 books weekly and had opinions, the friend who hosted dinner parties and made people laugh. Brandon hadn't just cheated. He'd spent 8 years systematically erasing me, and I'd helped him do it by believing every cruel word. The cold feeling in my chest was spreading now. But it wasn't bad cold. It was clarifying cold, the kind that makes you see things sharply after years of fog. I carefully folded the receipt and placed it in my pocket. Then I finished the laundry because even in revolution, routines persist. But my mind was already somewhere else entirely, somewhere Brandon had never allowed me to go, toward the possibility that maybe I wasn't the broken one after all. The next morning, I woke at 5:30 like always, That internal alarm clock Brandon had trained into me over years of criticism about sleeping past 6 making me lazy. He was still asleep, sprawled across his side of the bed in those expensive pajamas, one arm flung over what used to be my pillow before I'd migrated to the mattress edge to avoid complaints about my breathing being too loud. I lay there for 4 minutes, watching him sleep, and realized I felt absolutely nothing. Not love, not hate, not even anger yet. Just vast empty space where my feelings for him used to live. I got up quietly and went downstairs to start his coffee. French press, never drip, because drip was what poor people drank according to Brandon. The beans had to be ground fresh, exactly 18 grams, water heated to 200 degrees, steeped for 4 minutes. Brandon had specific requirements about everything, and I'd memorized them all because deviating meant lectures about my inability to follow simple instructions. While the water heated, I pulled the Cartier receipt from where I'd hidden it inside my copy of Jane Eyre, tucked between pages 412 and 413, right where Jane tells Rochester she is no bird and no net ensnares her. I photographed it with my phone, hands steadier than expected, then returned it to the book. Brandon never touched my books. He'd told me multiple times that reading fiction was escapism for people who couldn't handle real life. I thought about the small cruelties that had accumulated like sediment over our marriage, layer upon layer until I couldn't remember what solid ground felt like. There was the time I'd gotten my hair cut without asking permission first, just 2 inches off, and Brandon had announced I'd never become a model. Sophie had been 6. She'd asked why Daddy was being mean to Mommy, and Brandon had explained he wasn't mean, just honest. Or the time I'd mentioned wanting to take an online creative writing class, and Brandon had pulled up my college transcripts right there at breakfast. He'd pointed to my B- in freshman composition and asked why I would pay money to embarrass myself. The course had cost $197. Brandon spent more than that on car washes monthly. There was the dinner party where I'd expressed an opinion about education policy, my actual area of expertise, and Brandon had interrupted to inform his colleagues that I didn't really follow politics, just repeated things I heard on morning shows. Later that night, Brandon had explained I needed to understand my lane, that nobody wanted to hear a housewife's thoughts on policy. Each incident had felt manageable in isolation, explainable, even justified by the little voice in my head that sounded increasingly like Brandon's voice. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe he was just being honest. Maybe this was normal. But now, standing in my kitchen at 5:43 with evidence of his betrayal, hidden in a 19th century novel about female independence, I could see the pattern clearly for the first time. This wasn't a husband being honest. This was systematic demolition of another person's sense of self. This was abuse, and I'd been living in it so long I'd started to think the walls closing in were just the natural architecture of marriage. The coffee finished steeping. I pressed the plunger down slowly, poured it into his world's best boss mug, added exactly 1 teaspoon of raw sugar and 2 tablespoons of heavy cream, stirred counterclockwise for 10 seconds. I carried it upstairs where Brandon was awake now, checking his phone, scrolling through messages with a small smile that disappeared when he noticed me. He mentioned the coffee took longer than usual. No good morning, no thank you, just immediate. Criticism before 6 in the morning. He had an early meeting and needed to be sharp. I apologized automatically, 8 years of conditioning making me say sorry for things that weren't my fault. But inside my head, a new voice was taking notes. Early meeting. Phone smiled at. $15,000 necklace. The pieces were connecting. Brandon informed me he'd be late that night. Important client dinner. Don't wait up. This was the 3rd client dinner this week. I used to ask questions, but he'd trained me out of that too by calling me paranoid and controlling, suggesting maybe if I were less suspicious he'd want to come home earlier. I told him I'd leave dinner in the fridge. He finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his expression I'd seen countless times but never named before. Contempt. Pure, undiluted contempt. He reminded me he didn't eat leftovers because they were depressing, and told me not to bother cooking at all. Don't bother. Don't bother existing in any way. That requires him to consider me as a person, instead of a service provider he's disappointed with. I nodded and left, closing the bedroom door softly, and felt something shifting in my chest. Not breaking, but moving, like tectonic plates adjusting deep underground, the kind of movement that changes landscapes permanently. I dropped Sophie at school that morning, and didn't go straight home like I was supposed to. Instead, I drove to the public library downtown, that beautiful old Carnegie building with stone lions flanking the entrance. I'd spent so much time here before marriage, before Brandon, when my life was still my own. Now I was here for a different kind of research, the kind that would either save me or confirm I was as trapped as I felt. I sat at one of the public computers and started searching. Divorce law in our state, financial rights and marriage dissolution, psychological abuse and emotional cruelty as grounds for separation. I read for 2 hours straight, taking notes in a small spiral notebook I'd bought at the dollar store with grocery money, careful to record every relevant detail. The law was clearer than I expected. 8 years of marriage meant significant claims to marital assets. Brandon's dealership, the one he always called his business like I hadn't been the one answering phones and managing schedules for the first 2 years while he built his client base. Legally, I'd helped build that. Legally, I had claims to its value. More importantly, I learned that financial control and isolation were recognized forms of domestic abuse. That constant criticism designed to undermine someone's self-esteem was psychological violence. Words like coercive control and financial abuse appeared on my screen, each one describing my marriage with uncomfortable precision. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't the problem. The realization hit me like cold water, shocking and clarifying all at once. I printed several articles and searched for divorce attorneys offering free consultations. I called the first one from the library payphone, my hands shaking as I dialed. The receptionist had a kind voice. She told me attorney Sarah Mitchell had an opening that afternoon at 2:30 if I could make it. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. At 2:20, I walked into Sarah Mitchell's office. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines that weren't 6 months old. These small dignities felt almost foreign after years of accepting whatever scraps Brandon decided I deserved. Sarah Mitchell was maybe 50, with gray hair she didn't try to hide, and direct eyes that seemed to see right through my careful composure. She invited me into her office, asked me to sit, and handed me a tissue box before I even realized I was crying. Then she asked me to tell her why I was there, and I found myself talking for 45 minutes straight, words pouring out like I'd been holding them behind a dam for 8 years. I told her about the Cartier receipt, about the $800 monthly allowance while Brandon spent thousands on himself, about the constant criticism that had worn me down to nothing, about how he'd convinced me I was incompetent and stupid, about Sophie's music school tuition he'd refused while buying diamond necklaces for someone else, about the perfume on his shirts, and the gaslighting that made me think my intuition was insanity. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally, her expression growing more serious. When I finally stopped, exhausted from saying out loud things I'd barely let myself think, she set down her pen and looked at me with something that might have been anger on my behalf. She told me I'd been subjected to prolonged psychological abuse and financial control, that what I'd described was textbook coercive behavior designed to destroy my autonomy and self-worth, that courts took these patterns seriously, especially when documented, that I had rights to half the marital assets, to spousal support while I reestablished financial independence, to have Brandon pay for therapy to undo the damage he'd caused. I started crying harder then, not from sadness, but from relief so intense it felt physical. Someone believed me. Someone with legal authority had listened to my story and hadn't told me I was overreacting or too sensitive. Someone had validated that what I'd suffered was real and wrong and actionable. Sarah explained the I process. Document everything from this point forward. Keep copies of financial records I could access. Write down incidents with dates and details. Record conversations if our state allowed single-party consent, which it did. Build a case that showed pattern and intent. She said if I was serious about leaving, she'd take my case for a reduced fee since I had limited access to money, with the rest paid from the settlement. She said she'd seen cases like mine before, men who used financial control and psychological manipulation to keep their wives trapped, and she'd won most of them. She said I was stronger than I thought, and that starting this process was the hardest part, and I'd already done it. I left her office at 3:40 with a folder full of information and a court date in my calendar, and a feeling in my chest I hadn't experienced in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Hope. Terrifying. Fragile. Dangerous hope that maybe I could actually do this. Actually leave. Actually reclaim the life Brandon had spent 8 years stealing piece by piece. I drove home and started dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, Brandon's favorite that he wouldn't eat because he'd be late. But I cooked it anyway, following the recipe perfectly, because I was still playing the role of devoted wife, for now. Because Brandon had no idea that the woman making his dinner had already hired a divorce attorney and started building a case that would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. I set the table for one, ate slowly, tasting the food for the first time in months instead of just pushing it around my plate. It was good. I was a good cook. I was good at a lot of things, actually, despite 8 years of being told otherwise. Brandon came home at 11:30. I was already in bed, pretending to sleep, listening to him move through the house with careful quiet. He didn't check on Sophie. He didn't come to our bed. I heard the guest room door close. I lay in the dark and thought about Sarah Mitchell's words. You're stronger than you think. The hardest part is starting. You've already done it. She was right. I had started, and there was no going back now. The next 2 weeks became a careful dance of pretending everything was normal while quietly building my escape route. I cooked Brandon's meals and cleaned his house and smiled when required, all while documenting every instance of financial control, every cruel comment, every late night that smelled of lies and expensive perfume. Sarah had given me a small voice recorder that fit in my pocket, and I'd started using it during our interactions, capturing Brandon's casual cruelty in his own voice. The first recording I made was 3 days after hiring Sarah. Brandon had come home early and found me reading on the couch. He'd told me I was wasting time that should be spent on useful activities. When I'd asked what useful activities he meant, since the house was clean and dinner was prepared, he'd gotten that edge in his voice that meant I was being difficult. He'd explained slowly, like talking to a child, that there was always something productive I could be doing. Organizing closets, researching cheaper grocery stores, working on myself, which was a forever project given my numerous flaws. The recording captured all of it, his condescending tone, his implication that my entire existence should be devoted to serving him better, but guilt came with it. At night, lying in bed while Brandon slept elsewhere, or didn't come home at all, I'd find myself questioning everything. Was I overreacting? Was documenting his behavior a betrayal of our marriage vows? These thoughts spiraled through my mind at 3 a.m, when I had nothing to distract me from the voice that sounded exactly like Brandon telling me I was the problem. I'd pull out my notebook then and reread what I'd written. The facts helped ground me. March 19th, $15,000 necklace purchased, while claiming we couldn't afford $3,000 music tuition. March 23rd, told me I was too stupid to understand finances. March 26th, came home at 1 a.m. smelling of perfume. The facts didn't lie, but still, the guilt persisted. That bone-deep conditioning that made me feel responsible for Brandon's happiness, for keeping everything together, no matter the cost to myself. Sophie became my anchor during those weeks of doubt. I'd watch her practice piano on the keyboard. We'd bought secondhand when Brandon refused music school. Watch her determined little face as she taught herself from YouTube videos, and I'd remember why I was doing this. Not just for me, but for her, so she wouldn't grow up thinking this was what love looked like. She'd started noticing changes in me. One morning, she'd commented that I seemed different, lighter somehow. I'd told her I was just tired, but she'd looked at me with those perceptive 12-year-old eyes and said I seemed less sad than usual, which broke my heart, because I hadn't realized my sadness had become so constant, she'd started measuring my moods against it. Dorothy, Brandon's mother, called during this time and invited herself to dinner. She did this periodically, these surprise inspections of our home and my adequacy as Brandon's wife. I'd always dreaded her visits, the way she'd comment on my appearance with thinly veiled criticism, remind me how lucky I was that her son had settled for someone like me. This time felt different. I made her favorite meal and set the table with our good china. She arrived precisely at 6, looked me up and down, and mentioned I'd gained weight, asked if I was pregnant or just letting myself go again. The recorder in my pocket captured every word. Throughout dinner, Dorothy talked about Brandon's success at the dealership, how proud she was of the man he'd become despite having to carry the weight of our struggling marriage. She mentioned several times how difficult it must be for him, having a wife who didn't contribute financially or socially. Brandon, who'd joined us late and distracted, checking his phone constantly, nodded along with everything she said. Sophie sat silently, pushing food around her plate, and I could see her processing her grandmother's words. When Dorothy asked Sophie if she was excited about Brandon's upcoming business trip to Seattle, a trip I knew nothing about, I watched my daughter's eyes dart between her father and me, understanding dawning that there were secrets in this house, lies being told. After they left, I found Sophie in her room. She'd been crying. I sat on her bed and asked what was wrong, and she'd asked me why Grandma Dorothy was so mean to me, why I let her talk to me that way, why Dad never defended me. I didn't have good answers, not ones a 12-year-old should hear. But Sophie had looked at me and said something that felt like prophecy. Someday you're going to stop letting them treat you like this, and when you do, I want to be just like you. That night I added Seattle business trip to my notes, underlining it twice. I called the dealership the next morning, pretending to be a client, asking when Brandon would be back from Seattle. The receptionist sounded confused, said Brandon wasn't scheduled for any trips to Seattle. Another lie. Another piece of evidence. The deadline was forming itself now. Dorothy's visit had shown me that this family would never see me as anything but decoration and disappointment. Sophie's tears had shown me that staying was teaching my daughter to accept mistreatment as love. The Seattle lie had shown me that Brandon's betrayal wasn't just ongoing but elaborate. I had maybe 6 weeks before I couldn't maintain this pretense anymore, before the mask would crack. 6 weeks to document enough evidence, to prepare Sophie for the earthquake that was coming. 6 weeks to transform from the broken woman Brandon had created into someone strong, enough to walk away. 3 weeks into my secret documentation, I finally worked up the courage to check our financial records. Brandon kept his laptop in his home office, the room he'd declared off-limits years ago, because I didn't understand business and might accidentally delete something important. But one Tuesday morning after he'd left for work, I stood in the doorway of that forbidden room and decided I was done respecting boundaries designed to keep me ignorant. His laptop password was Sophie's birthday, which would have been touching if he'd ever actually remembered to call her on that day without me reminding him 3 times. I opened his banking app and felt my hands go numb as the numbers loaded. Our joint checking account held $8,312. The account I couldn't see, his personal business account, held $147,623. $147,000 he'd hidden while telling me we couldn't afford a $3,000 music program for our daughter, while giving me $800 monthly and acting like it was generous, while making me feel guilty for buying Sophie new shoes. I sat in his expensive leather desk chair and methodically photographed every screen. Bank statements going back 2 years showing regular large withdrawals. Credit card statements for cards I didn't know existed. Charges at expensive restaurants I'd never been to. Hotels in cities he'd never mentioned visiting, jewelry stores and boutiques and flower shops. A life he was living completely separate from ours, funded by money he claimed we didn't have. There were emails too, ones he'd apparently forgotten to delete. Correspondence with someone named Amber Whitfield. Pet names and inside jokes and plans to meet. A message from last week mentioning how the necklace looked beautiful on her, how she'd worn it to the charity gala and everyone had admired it, how generous he was, how she couldn't wait to see him in Seattle next month. Seattle, the business trip that didn't exist according to his office. The trip Dorothy had mentioned at dinner. It wasn't a business trip at all. It was a romantic getaway with the woman wearing my daughter's music education around her neck. I should have felt devastated. Instead, I felt coldly, crystal clearly vindicated. Every instinct I'd had was right. Every suspicion he'd gaslit me into doubting was accurate. Every time he'd called me paranoid and controlling and crazy, he'd been projecting his own lies onto my legitimate questions. I downloaded everything onto a flash drive I'd bought with grocery money, then cleared the browser history and logged out carefully, leaving no trace. The evidence was damning enough that Sarah would probably get me more than half of everything. But the money wasn't even the worst part. As I kept scrolling through his emails, I found correspondence with Dorothy that made my blood run cold. Messages where they discussed me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person. Dorothy suggesting Brandon might be happier with someone more sophisticated. Brandon agreeing, but saying divorce was expensive and complicated. There was an email from 2 months ago where Dorothy had suggested he document my inadequacies, my depression, my weight fluctuations, any mistakes I made with Sophie, to build a case for custody if it came to that. Brandon had responded that it probably wouldn't be necessary, that I was so broken down by this point, I'd likely accept whatever he offered just to avoid conflict, that 8 years of conditioning had made me compliant and easy to control. They'd been planning this, not just the affair, but the eventual disposal of me, discussing me like I was a malfunctioning appliance they were considering replacing. The cruelty was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it took my breath away. I hadn't realized it was strategic, coordinated with his mother, designed with clear intent to destroy my confidence so thoroughly I'd accept whatever scraps they decided to throw me. I printed those emails too, hands shaking now with anger instead of fear. Sarah needed to see this. That afternoon, I visited Sarah's office with my flash drive full of evidence. She spent 40 minutes reviewing documents, her expression growing more serious with each file. When she finally looked up, she told me this was better than she'd hoped, worse than she'd feared. Better, because we had ironclad documentation of financial fraud and hidden assets. Worse, because the emails showed premeditation that crossed from normal marital discord into genuine psychological abuse. She said we could go after not just half the assets, but potentially more given the hidden accounts. That the emails between Brandon and Dorothy could support claims of intentional infliction of emotional distress. That his spending on Amber, while restricting my access to marital funds, was financial. Abuse courts took seriously, but she also warned me about the next phase. Once I filed, Brandon would know. The man who'd spent 8 years controlling every aspect of my life would lose that control, and men like him didn't handle that well. She advised me to prepare Sophie, to stay with friends or family when I served him papers. I hadn't considered that Brandon might become dangerous when cornered, but Sarah was right. I didn't actually know what he was capable of when he wasn't getting his way, because I'd spent 8 years making sure he always got his way. That night I called my sister Jennifer, who I hadn't spoken to properly in 3 years because Brandon had slowly isolated me from everyone who might question his treatment of me. She answered surprised because I never called anymore. I told her everything. The Cartier receipt, the hidden bank accounts, the emails with Dorothy plotting my destruction, the affair with Amber. She cried listening to me, then got angry, then told me she'd suspected something was wrong for years, but hadn't known how to help when I kept insisting everything was fine. She offered her spare room for Sophie and me when I was ready to leave. The call lasted 2 hours, and felt like coming up for air after being underwater so long I'd forgotten what breathing normally felt like. Sophie came home from school and found me in the kitchen, eyes still red. She asked if I was okay, and I realized I was tired of lying to my daughter. So I sat her down and told her age-appropriate truth, that her father and I were getting divorced, that it wasn't her fault, that we'd be moving in with Aunt Jennifer for a little while. She cried, but not as much as I expected. Later she'd tell me she'd been expecting this. That part of her was relieved to finally know the truth. That night, I sat in Brandon's forbidden office and looked at the life he'd built on lies. He thought he'd been so clever, so strategic, but he'd underestimated the woman he'd married. The one with research skills and a mind he'd tried so hard to convince me was worthless. In 2 weeks, I would file for divorce. In 2 weeks, he'd discover that the wife he'd spent 8 years breaking had spent the last month rebuilding herself into something he hadn't anticipated. Someone who fought back. The night before I planned to file for divorce, Brandon came home early and told me we needed to talk. Those 4 words landed in my stomach like stones, because in 8 years of marriage, Brandon announcing we needed to talk had never preceded anything good. Usually it meant he'd found some new failure of mine to dissect, some fresh evidence of my inadequacy that required lengthy explanation. He sat at the kitchen table and told me to sit across from him, using that tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. I sat, heart pounding, wondering if somehow he'd discovered what I was planning. The flash drive with all his financial records and incriminating emails was hidden in my tampon box, the one place I knew he'd never look. He folded his hands on the table, that gesture he used in business meetings, the one that said he was about to deliver news that wouldn't be negotiable. Then he told me he wanted another baby, a son this time, because Sophie was fine, but every man wanted a son to carry on his name, to inherit his business. He said we'd start trying immediately, that I should stop taking my birth control pills tonight, that this wasn't really a discussion but a decision he'd made. I stared at him across our kitchen table and felt something inside me snap completely, not break. This was more like ice finally melting after a long winter, all that frozen numbness turning to cold rushing water that wouldn't be stopped. He wanted to trap me with another baby, wanted to reset the timer on how long I'd be dependent on him, wanted to create another 8 years of me being too tired and too broke and too defeated to leave. He was telling me this now because some instinct had warned him I was slipping his control, and his solution was to tighten his grip, to create new chains when the old ones were starting to loosen. I told him no, just that one word, calm and clear and final. The look on his face was almost worth 8 years of misery, pure shock that I'd contradicted him, that the wife he'd spent nearly a decade conditioning into compliance had suddenly developed a spine. His shock lasted maybe 5 seconds before turning to anger. He told me I was being selfish and childish, that he provided everything for this family, that most women would be grateful their husbands still wanted them enough to have another child, especially women my age who weren't exactly prize catches anymore, that I was lucky he was willing to overlook my numerous flaws. I stood up from the table, legs steadier than expected, and told him I was going to bed. He followed me upstairs, his voice rising with each step, listing all the ways I was ungrateful and difficult, how he'd given me a good life and financial security. How dare I refuse him this one thing when he asked for so little? The irony of him claiming to ask for so little while demanding I create a human being I didn't want would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly representative of our entire marriage. His little requests had consumed my entire existence, my career, my identity, my sense of self-worth, my friendships, my autonomy. I locked myself in the bedroom and heard him pacing outside, muttering about disrespect and insubordination like I was his employee instead of his wife. Eventually, he went to the guest room, and I heard him on the phone, voice low and angry, calling his mother to complain about me, to strategize about how to handle my sudden defiance. I lay in bed thinking about tomorrow, about walking into the courthouse and filing papers that would make this separation legal and permanent, about the look on Brandon's face when he was served with divorce documents, about Sophie waking up in Jennifer's house instead of this one. Fear crept in then, cold and insidious. What if Sarah was right about Brandon becoming dangerous? What if taking away his control triggered something worse than verbal abuse? But then I thought about Sophie, and what I'd be teaching her if I stayed. That women should set themselves on fire to keep men warm. That your body wasn't yours when a man decided he wanted to use it. I couldn't teach her those lessons. I wouldn't. My phone buzzed, with a text from Jennifer checking if I was okay, if I still planned to come tomorrow. I texted back that I was fine. Everything was on schedule. Then I turned off my phone before Brandon could see the messages. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, memorizing the sounds because tomorrow they'd belong to my past instead of my present. At 6, I gave up and got out of bed, showered and dressed in jeans and a sweater, practical clothes for moving. Brandon was already awake when I went downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, eyes cold with residual anger from last night. He told me he'd been thinking about our conversation, that he was willing to be patient about the baby issue, that we could revisit it in a few months. This was Brandon's version of compromise, deciding unilaterally to delay his demand instead of accepting my refusal. I poured my own coffee and didn't respond. Let him think his patience was generous. Let him think he still had control. In 8 hours, I'd be in a lawyer's office filing paperwork that would destroy his illusions permanently. Sophie came downstairs with her backpack, the one I'd carefully packed last night with clothes and toiletries, and her favorite stuffed elephant. Brandon asked why she had a backpack on Saturday, and I told him she was spending the weekend at Jennifer's. The lie came easily, smoothed by 8 years of practice saying whatever would avoid conflict. He frowned, but didn't question it further, too preoccupied with his phone. I drove Sophie to Jennifer's house first, taking the long route, making sure Brandon couldn't follow. Jennifer met us at the door with hugs and fierce protective energy. Mark took Sophie to help his kids make pancakes, while Jennifer and I went over the plan one more time. At 2 o'clock, I was supposed to meet Sarah at her office to sign final paperwork. At 2:30, a process server would deliver divorce documents to Brandon at our home. By 3 o'clock, Brandon would know everything. I left Jennifer's house at 1:45, drove to Sarah's office with my hand steady on the wheel, and thought about the moment Brandon would open that envelope. The shock, the rage, the desperate scrambling to understand how I'd done this. He'd underestimated me. That was his fatal error. He'd confused compliance with stupidity, silence with ignorance, depression with inability. He was about to discover he'd been very, very wrong. I signed the divorce papers at 2:17. Sarah filed them electronically at 2:23. The process server confirmed delivery at 2:34. My phone stayed silent until 2:47, and then it exploded with calls and texts from Brandon. 17 calls in 3 minutes. So I sat in my car and watched my phone light up with Brandon's fury and felt nothing but cold, clear satisfaction that the man who'd spent 8 years making me feel small finally understood what it felt like. To be powerless. The voicemails Brandon left between 2:47 and 4:15 that afternoon would become evidence in our divorce proceedings, his rage preserved digitally for judges to hear in his own voice. The first few were confused, asking where I was, telling me to call him immediately, saying we needed to discuss this ridiculous misunderstanding. By message 7, his tone had shifted to anger, demanding I come home right now, threatening to call the police and report Sophie kidnapped. By message 14, he was bargaining, saying we could work this out, that he'd been a good husband and I was throwing away our family over nothing. Message 17 was Dorothy. Her voice dripped venom through my phone speaker as she called me ungrateful and vindictive, accused me of poisoning Sophie against her father, threatened to testify about my mental instability making me unfit for custody. She'd clearly been with Brandon when he was served, had probably been there, strategizing their next move, never imagining I'd recorded their emails plotting my destruction. I saved every voicemail, forwarded them to Sarah, and drove to a coffee shop 3 towns over where no one would recognize me. I needed somewhere public and safe to wait out Brandon's initial explosion, somewhere he couldn't find me if he decided to come looking. Jennifer had texted that Sophie was fine, happily playing video games with her cousins, blissfully unaware that her father was currently melting down 30 miles away. My hands shook as I ordered coffee I didn't drink, sitting in a corner booth where I could see the door, jumping every time it opened. Sarah had warned me this part would be hardest, the hours after filing when the abuser's control shattered, and their reaction was most unpredictable. At 5:30, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Brandon's voice came through, calmer now, which was somehow more terrifying than the rage. He told me he was at Jennifer's house, that Jennifer claimed not to know where I was, but he knew Sophie was there. He said he just wanted to talk, to understand why I was doing this, to work things out like adults. I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background telling him to leave her property, heard Mark's deeper voice backing her up, heard Brandon's smooth response that he just wanted to see his daughter. The manipulation in his tone was crystal clear to me after 8 years. I told him Sophie was safe, and that all communication needed to go through our lawyers. He laughed. Not his real laugh, but that cruel, condescending sound he made when I said something he found stupid. He told me I was being dramatic, that I'd clearly had some kind of breakdown, that he was worried about me. Classic Brandon, reframing his abuse as my mental instability. I hung up and immediately called Sarah, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She told me Brandon showing up at Jennifer's was harassment and she'd file for a restraining order Monday morning. She asked if I felt safe, if I needed somewhere else to stay tonight. I told her I'd go to a hotel. The hotel I found was a chain off the highway, anonymous and clean. I checked in under my maiden name, Rachel Summers, a woman who'd existed before Brandon Ashford convinced her she was worthless, and locked myself in room 214. The bed was too soft, but it was mine, my choice, my safety, my space that Brandon couldn't invade. I ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor with my back against the door, jumping at every sound in the hallway. This was freedom, I reminded myself. This anxiety and cheap hotel room were still better than the prison of my marriage. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophie asking if I was okay, if Dad was okay, if everything was going to be all right. Jennifer must have told her something about Brandon showing up. I texted back that I was fine, that Dad was adjusting to big changes, that yes, everything would be okay. The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. At 9:30, Dorothy called from her own number, leaving a voicemail that made the earlier one sound gentle. She told me I'd destroyed her son, ruined his reputation, stolen his child, and she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of vindictive monster I really was. She'd call my old school and tell them I was unstable, contact Sophie's teachers, tell everyone in our social circle that I'd had an affair, and was projecting my guilt onto Brandon. The threats were specific and detailed. I saved that voicemail too, added it to the growing file of evidence that Brandon and Dorothy had coordinated their abuse. Every threat they made just strengthened my case and validated my decision to leave. I pushed the room's desk chair under the door handle, the way I'd seen in movies, needing the psychological comfort of an extra barrier. Then I lay on top of the covers fully dressed, phone clutched in my hand, ready to call 911 if I heard anything suspicious. Sleep felt impossible, but must have come eventually because I woke at 3 a.m. to my phone buzzing with another call from Brandon. This time I didn't answer, just listened to him leave voicemail number 23, his voice slurring slightly with alcohol now, saying he'd checked our bank accounts and I'd better not have taken any money that wasn't mine, that he'd have me arrested for fraud. The irony was almost funny. Brandon accusing me of financial crimes when I had documentation of his hidden accounts. I checked our joint account and saw he'd already emptied it, transferred all $8,312 to an account I couldn't access. Now I had $17 in my wallet and a maxed-out credit card. The panic tried to set in then, that old, familiar fear about money and survival. But I breathed through it, reminded myself that Sarah was working on contingency, that I had a place at Jennifer's. At 6 a.m., I checked out and drove to a diner for breakfast I couldn't afford, but needed anyway. Hot coffee and scrambled eggs felt like rebellion. The waitress who refilled my coffee had kind eyes and didn't ask why I looked like I'd slept in my clothes. Sarah texted saying she'd filed the restraining order request first thing, citing Brandon's harassment at Jennifer's home and the threatening voicemails. We had a hearing scheduled for Tuesday morning. 2 days felt like an eternity to wait for legal protection. At 8, I drove to Jennifer's house, exhausted and wired simultaneously. Jennifer met me at the door with more coffee and that look of fierce protective anger. She told me Brandon had called 6 times this morning asking to speak to Sophie. The day stretched long and tense, waiting for Tuesday's hearing, waiting for Brandon's next move. Mark stayed home from work without being asked, his presence a quiet deterrent. At 4 p.m., Brandon's assistant manager called to say Brandon hadn't shown up for work today and wasn't answering calls. He sounded genuinely concerned. I told him Brandon and I were separating. The call left me unsettled. Brandon never missed work. His dealership was his pride, his identity. If he was somewhere unknown and unreachable, what was he doing? The not knowing felt worse than his rage. Sarah called at 6 and told me to stay at Jennifer's tonight, to keep doors locked, to call police immediately if Brandon showed up. Night fell, and I helped Jennifer make dinner, moving through the motions of normal life while my phone stayed silent. Brandon's absence somehow more ominous than his harassment. At 10 p.m., I tucked Sophie into bed, kissed her forehead, told her I loved her more than anything. Then I went to Jennifer's living room and waited for Tuesday, for the restraining order hearing, for Brandon's next move. Brandon had spent 8 years making sure I never knew what was coming, but I'd spent 6 weeks learning to plan. Whatever he did next, I'd be ready, or at least readier than the woman who'd found a Cartier receipt 6 weeks ago and decided enough was enough. Tuesday morning arrived with rain, the kind of steady downpour that made everything feel appropriately dramatic for a restraining order hearing. I dressed carefully in Jennifer's guest room, choosing clothes that said competent adult instead of broken victim. Navy slacks, white blouse, cardigan that had been mine before Brandon convinced me it made me look frumpy. Looking at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, but determined. Nothing like the apologetic ghost I'd been 6 weeks ago. Sarah met me at the courthouse at 8:30, reviewing our strategy one final time. We had the voicemails, the documentation of Brandon showing up at Jennifer's house, the threatening texts from Dorothy, the emails plotting to use my depression against me. The evidence was overwhelming, but Sarah warned me that Brandon would be charming. In court, would present himself as the reasonable party dealing with an unstable wife. Brandon arrived at 8:50 with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Patricia Caldwell. He'd dressed in his best suit, the charcoal one he wore to close major deals, and his face was carefully arranged in an expression of concerned confusion. This was Brandon's public persona, the successful businessman everyone liked. I watched him scan the hallway until his eyes landed on me, and for just a second, his mask slipped. Pure rage flashed across his face before he smoothed it back into wounded bewilderment. We filed into the courtroom at 9, sitting on opposite sides. Judge Maria Henderson presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed our filings silently for what felt like hours, then asked Sarah to present our case. Sarah was methodical and devastating. She played 3 of Brandon's most threatening voicemails, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Dripping with rage as he demanded I come home immediately, threatened to have me arrested for kidnapping, called me mentally unstable and unfit. She presented documentation of him showing up at Jennifer's house despite being told to leave. Then she brought out the emails between Brandon and Dorothy discussing how to document my inadequacies for custody purposes, how to use my depression against me, how I was so broken down I'd accept whatever he offered. I watched Brandon's face as his own words played in court, watched his attorney's expression shift from confident to concerned, watched the judge's jaw tighten. This wasn't a man worried about his marriage. This was calculated destruction preserved in digital format. Patricia tried to recover, arguing that the voicemails showed a concerned husband trying to reach his wife, who'd disappeared with their daughter, without warning, that the emails with his mother were taken out of context. But Sarah was ready, producing the Cartier receipt, and bank statements showing Brandon had spent $15,000 on jewelry for another woman while claiming we couldn't afford our daughter's $3,000 music tuition, had hidden nearly $150,000 in accounts I couldn't access while giving me $800 monthly. The financial evidence shifted something in Judge Henderson's expression. She asked Brandon directly if he'd hidden marital assets and restricted his wife's access to funds while spending freely on himself and extramarital relationships. Patricia advised him not to answer, but his silence was answer enough. Then Sarah played her final card. She presented my medical records from the last 3 years, showing my depression had worsened significantly, that I'd asked my doctor multiple times for medication, but couldn't afford it because my husband controlled all finances, and said antidepressants were unnecessary luxury. She presented text messages where I'd asked Brandon if we could please afford therapy, and he'd responded that I didn't need therapy. I needed to try harder not to be so negative. Watching the judge read through notes from my doctor expressing concern about my worsening depression and inability to access treatment due to husband's financial control, I felt simultaneously exposed and validated. This was proof that Brandon's abuse had measurable impact on my mental health. Patricia tried one more angle, suggesting I'd been free to work and earn my own money if I'd wanted. Therapy so badly. Sarah smiled and produced recordings where Brandon told me I was too incompetent to work, that no one would hire me. She showed emails where I'd applied to teaching positions 3 years ago, and Brandon had sent my potential employers anonymous messages claiming I'd been fired from my previous job for inappropriate conduct with students, lies so vicious they'd destroyed my chances before I even got interviews. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even Patricia looked shocked. Brandon's face had gone pale, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking as he realized the wife he'd thought too broken to fight back had documented everything. Judge Henderson removed her glasses and looked directly at Brandon for a long moment. Then she ruled, her voice cold and precise. Temporary restraining order granted. Brandon was to stay minimum 500 feet away from me, from Jennifer's residence, from Sophie's school. All contact regarding their daughter was to go through attorneys. He was ordered to restore half the joint account funds immediately, plus provide temporary spousal support of $2,000 monthly. The judge noted that the evidence suggested financial abuse and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and she was referring the case to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges related to the forged emails sent to my potential employers. Criminal charges. I hadn't even considered that possibility. Brandon's face went from pale to gray as Patricia whispered urgently in his ear. Judge Henderson addressed Brandon directly, telling him that in her 30 years on the bench, she'd seen many divorce cases, but few with such clear documentation of systematic abuse and control. She told him that his behavior suggested he viewed his wife as property to be managed, rather than a person with rights and autonomy. We left the courthouse at 10:45 with the restraining order in hand. Sarah was elated, telling me the judge's comments would carry significant weight in settlement negotiations, that Brandon's attorney would almost certainly advise him to settle generously rather than go to trial where all this evidence would become public record. Jennifer picked me up outside and I told her everything. She cried angry tears while I stayed dry-eyed, still in that strange, numb space where emotions existed, but couldn't quite touch me yet. Sarah called at 3 to say Brandon's attorney had already reached out about settlement discussions. Apparently, Patricia had advised her client that going to trial would be financial and reputational suicide, that his best option was to settle generously and quickly. I told Sarah what I wanted: 40% of the dealership's value, the house in my name, $2,000 monthly support for 5 years, all of Sophie's educational expenses, and 3 years of therapy covered. Patricia called back at 5 with a counteroffer: 35% of Batsu. Dealership value, the house in my name, $1,800 monthly for 4 years, Sophie's educational expenses, and 2 years of therapy. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. Then I told Sarah to accept, not because Brandon deserved to pay less, but because I wanted this over. Every day we negotiated was another day. Sophie lived in limbo. Another day Brandon had any claim on my energy. The settlement was drafted that evening and signed by 8 p.m. Just like that, 8 years of marriage dissolved into legal documents. Brandon agreed to everything without further negotiation. That night, I lay in Jennifer's guest room and let myself finally cry. Not sad tears, but release. Relief so intense it felt physical, washing through me in waves. Brandon Ashford no longer had any power over me. Tomorrow I'd start looking for apartments. Tomorrow I'd become whoever Rachel Summers was supposed to be, before Brandon convinced me she wasn't worth being. But tonight I just lay in the dark and breathed, counting each breath as proof that I'd survived, that the woman Brandon had tried to erase had somehow endured and emerged scarred but unbroken. 6 months after the restraining order hearing, I stood in the doorway of my new apartment, mine and Sophie's, a 2-bedroom place on the 3rd floor with windows that let in actual sunlight. The settlement money had given me first and last month's rent plus security deposit, enough left over for furniture I'd chosen myself. The couch was burgundy velvet, completely impractical, and absolutely perfect. Every single item in this space reflected my taste, my choices, my life that was finally mine again. Sophie had decorated her room in shades of purple, her keyboard from music school positioned by the window where afternoon light made practicing feel like joy. She'd started classes again 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and her teacher said she had real talent. Watching her play now, I could see confidence growing in her. Posture, in the way she approached difficult pieces without the fear of failure that had characterized so much of her childhood with Brandon. The teaching job had materialized faster than I'd expected. Mrs. Henderson, the principal who'd hired me as substitute 2 years ago, had called with a permanent position teaching 10th grade English. She'd remembered how students had responded to my methods. I'd almost told her she had the wrong person, that I wasn't capable, before catching myself. That was Brandon's voice, not truth. I was more than capable. I had a master's degree and 8 years of marriage that had taught me how to read subtext and manage difficult personalities. My first paycheck had felt surreal. Money I'd earned through my own competence deposited into an account only I controlled. $1,100 every 2 weeks. Not wealth, but enough combined with Brandon's support payments to cover rent and groceries, and Sophie's activities with some left over. Books without guilt. Coffee at cafes where I could read uninterrupted. Small freedoms that added up to a life I actually wanted to live. Brandon had faded into background noise, existing only as mandatory child support payments that arrived on time because his lawyer had strongly advised compliance. He'd married Amber 4 months after our divorce finalized. Sophie had met her twice and reported that Amber seemed nice, but quiet, really quiet. The kind of quiet that came from being careful. I'd recognized the description immediately. That was me 3 years into our marriage. I'd wanted to warn Amber, but that wasn't my responsibility. Some lessons people had to learn themselves. Dorothy had tried reaching out once through Sophie, suggesting lunch to discuss our differences. I'd declined through my lawyer, maintaining boundaries that therapy had taught me were necessary. Dorothy had enabled Brandon's abuse, had actively strategized my destruction. My therapist said some relationships were meant to end, that not every bridge was worth rebuilding. Therapy itself had been revelation. Weekly sessions peeling back layers of damage to find the person underneath. Dr. Sarah Chen was patient and direct, never letting me minimize Brandon's abuse. She'd given me language for what I'd experienced. Gaslighting, financial abuse, coercive control, terms that made my suffering real and nameable. She'd taught me that depression wasn't character weakness, but rational response to impossible circumstances, that my instincts had been right all along. The hardest work had been untangling which thoughts belonged to me, and which belonged to Brandon's campaign to destroy my self-worth. That voice saying I was stupid? Brandon's, not mine. I had a master's degree and students who sought my feedback. The voice saying I was ugly? Brandon's, not mine. I was a woman in her late 30s who looked exactly how she was supposed to look. The voice saying I was incompetent? Brandon's, not mine. I managed a classroom, paid my bills, raised a thoughtful daughter. Slowly, I'd learned to recognize those voices as invasive species in my mental landscape, thoughts planted by someone who needed me broken to feel powerful. Some days I could dismiss them easily. Other days they still echoed. But even on hard days, I had evidence now. Legal documents confirming abuse, students' essays thanking me, Sophie's laughter filling our apartment, my own reflection showing someone who looked progressively less haunted. My social life had rebuilt gradually, reconnecting with friends I'd lost during marriage. Jennifer remained my anchor, the sister who'd opened her home when I had nowhere to go. We had dinner together every Sunday, our families blending into something warm that bore no resemblance to the tense, silent meals of my marriage. I'd started writing again, journaling at first, and then attempting essays about recovery and rebuilding. I'd submitted one essay to a small literary magazine. When the acceptance email arrived 2 months later, I'd cried in my empty apartment, not because publication meant I was good enough, but because I'd done something purely for myself, without requiring anyone's permission. Sophie's relationship with Brandon had settled into routine that seemed healthy enough. She saw him every other weekend, came home sometimes frustrated by his criticism, but able to name it now as his issue, not hers. We'd had long talks about how loving someone didn't mean accepting mistreatment. She'd asked once if I hated him, and I'd been honest. I didn't hate Brandon. I pitied him, pitied the kind of person who could only feel powerful by making others feel small. Sometimes late at night, I'd think about the woman who'd found that Cartier receipt 8 months ago. How scared she'd been, how broken down, how close she'd come to never leaving. I felt simultaneously connected to and distant from that version of myself. She was me, but I was also someone different now, someone who'd survived and fought back. The transformation hadn't been linear. There were still days when I woke up feeling worthless, when Brandon's voice in my head was louder than my own. But those days came less frequently, and when they did, I had tools to manage them. I'd learned that healing wasn't destination, but ongoing practice, daily choice to believe I deserved better. Even on hardest days, I never regretted leaving, never wished I'd stayed. Looking around my apartment now, walls painted, colors I'd chosen, furniture I'd selected, life I'd built, I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. Pride. Not arrogant pride, but quiet satisfaction that I'd survived something designed to destroy me. I wasn't the same person I'd been before Brandon, probably never would be again. But I was becoming someone new, someone stronger for having been broken and choosing to rebuild. Sophie called from her room asking if we could order pizza for dinner, and I said yes without calculating the cost, or worrying about perfection. We ordered extra cheese, and ate sitting on the burgundy couch watching a movie Sophie had chosen. And this simple, ordinary evening felt revolutionary. Dinner without criticism, evening without tension, life without walking on eggshells. This was my victory. Not destroying Brandon or even getting fair settlement, though both mattered. The real victory was this moment. Pizza with my daughter in our own apartment. No one monitoring what we ate or criticizing our choices. Freedom to exist without constant evaluation. Permission to be imperfect without being punished. Space to discover who I actually was beneath 8 years of being told I was worthless. If I could go back and tell that woman in the laundry room holding the Cartier receipt that 8 months later she'd be here, independent, employed, healing, genuinely happy more often than not, I don't know if she'd believe me. But I'd tell her that leaving was the hardest thing she'd ever do, but also the most important. That she was stronger than she knew, smarter than Brandon claimed, more capable than 8 years of conditioning had convinced her. The money was never really tight. His lies cost him everything. And those same lies gave me my best life, not perfect life, not easy life, but mine. Finally, completely, wonderfully, mine. So if you're reading this from your own laundry room, holding your own receipt or evidence that the person who claims to love you is actually stealing your life, listen to me. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're seeing clearly. Probably for the first time in years. Document everything. Talk to a lawyer. Make a plan. Get out safely. It will be scary and uncertain. You'll doubt yourself. You'll hear his voice telling you you're incompetent. But on the other side of that fear is life that's actually yours. Freedom isn't perfect. It's not easy, but it's yours. And after years of living someone else's life on someone else's terms, yours is everything. And I promise you, that's worth every scary, uncertain step it takes to get here.